I still remember the sound the elevator made on the 47th floor. A soft chime, then a pause that lasted a fraction too long. I noticed it every morning for 11 years. I noticed everything. That was my job, after all. Noticing. I was a compliance officer for a financial institution I will not name. The building still stands in a city I no longer visit. My desk sat in a corner office with a window that faced east, which meant I watched the sun rise over the same skyline every morning while I reviewed documentation that most people would have found unbearable. I found it comforting. Numbers followed rules. Procedures had outcomes. If you followed the correct steps in the correct order, you arrived at the correct result. This was a truth I had built my entire career upon, and for a very long time, it served me well. I was good at my job. I want to be clear about that. I caught errors that saved the institution millions. I flagged patterns that prevented regulatory disasters. I was promoted twice in 4 years and given a team of my own. 6 junior analysts who looked at me the way I once looked at my own supervisor, with a mixture of respect and wariness, uncertain whether my attention was a gift or a threat. The answer, I suppose, was both. I believed in systems. I believed that systems, when properly designed and faithfully followed, protected people. They protected employees from arbitrary decisions. They protected clients from institutional negligence. They protected everyone from the chaos that would otherwise consume organizations of our size. I still believe this. That is what makes what happened so difficult to explain. The woman's name was Ellen. I learned this later, much later, when everything had already been decided. At the time, she was only a number, a case file, a pattern of transactions that did not conform to expected behavior. Her account had been flagged by our automated monitoring system for unusual activity. The system was sophisticated, trained on decades of data, and it rarely flagged accounts without cause. When it did, procedure required a review within 72 hours. I assigned the case to one of my analysts, a young man named Thomas, who had been with the institution for only 8 months, but had already demonstrated the kind of precise, methodical thinking that compliance work requires. He came to my office 3 days later with the file in his hands and an expression I had learned to recognize. It was the look people wore when they had found something they did not want to explain. The account belonged to a woman in her late 60s, a retired school teacher. Her husband had died 2 years earlier, and she had been living on a fixed income, supplemented by a modest pension and social security. The numbers were not unusual. The numbers were ordinary in the way that most lives, when reduced to transactions, become ordinary. What had triggered the flag was a series of withdrawals, large sums, transferred to an external account we could not identify. The pattern suggested fraud. Not fraud committed by Ellen, but fraud committed against her. Someone was taking her money. Thomas had done additional research, which was outside the scope of his assigned responsibilities, but not explicitly prohibited. He had found news articles from a regional paper describing a scam targeting elderly residents. The pattern matched precisely. He placed the file on my desk and waited. I read it twice, which was more attention than most cases received. The documentation was thorough. The conclusion was clear. Ellen was being defrauded, almost certainly by someone who had gained her trust and was now systematically draining her savings. Thomas asked me what we should do. I told him the truth. I told him that our procedures were explicit. Suspected fraud against a customer required documentation and reporting to the appropriate regulatory authority. We were not law enforcement. We were not investigators. Our role was to identify, document, and report. The regulatory authority would determine what action, if any, was required. He asked if we could contact Ellen directly, to warn her. I told him no. I told him that contacting customers about suspected fraud was not within our procedural authority. It created liability. It interfered with potential investigations. It was explicitly prohibited. He asked if we could flag the account for expedited review by the regulatory authority. I told him no. The regulatory authority processed reports in the order they were received. Expedited review required evidence of imminent harm, and while the withdrawals were concerning, they did not meet the threshold our procedures defined as imminent. He asked what would happen to Ellen. I told him I did not know. I told him that was not our responsibility. Our responsibility was to follow procedure, which we had done. The system would take care of the rest. Thomas left my office with the file. I watched him walk back to his desk, and I noticed the way his shoulders moved, the way his pace slowed as he reached his chair. I recognized something in him that I had once felt myself, years ago, before I learned that systems required faith. He was disappointed. He thought I had made the wrong decision. I was certain I had not. Procedure existed for a reason. If every analyst contacted every customer whose account showed signs of potential fraud, we would create chaos. We would expose the institution to lawsuits. We would interfere with legitimate investigations. We would undermine the very systems that had been designed to protect people. The rules were clear. The rules had always been clear, and I had followed them precisely. The weeks that followed were ordinary. I processed other cases. I attended meetings. I reviewed documentation and signed off on reports and watched the sun rise over the same skyline every morning. Ellen's case moved through the system at the pace the system required. The regulatory authority received our report. They assigned it to a queue. Someone, somewhere, added it to a list of cases awaiting review. I thought about her sometimes. Not often, but sometimes late in the day, when the office had grown quiet and I was finishing the last of my documentation, I would remember the file, the withdrawals, the pattern that suggested someone was taking advantage of a woman who trusted them. I told myself that the system would handle it. That was what systems were for. Thomas resigned 6 weeks later. He gave 2 weeks' notice, which was standard, and he worked diligently through his remaining days, which was also standard. He did not explain his decision, but I understood. He had lost faith. I did not blame him. Some people are not suited for compliance work. Some people cannot accept that following rules sometimes means accepting outcomes they find uncomfortable. They want to believe that there is always a right answer, a way to help everyone, a path that leads to the best possible result. I had learned that this was not always true. Sometimes the best you could do was follow the procedure and trust that the system, in aggregate, would produce better outcomes than chaos would have produced. It was not perfect. It was never perfect. But it was the best we could manage. I believed this completely. 3 months after Thomas resigned, I received a letter. It was not addressed to me personally. It was addressed to my department, which was standard for external correspondence. But someone in the mailroom had recognized the name on the return address, and they had placed it on my desk with a note attached. The note said, "You should read this." The letter was from Ellen's daughter. It was handwritten, which surprised me. Most correspondence we received was typed, impersonal, filtered through attorneys and regulatory intermediaries. This letter was personal in a way that made me uncomfortable. She wrote that her mother had passed away, not from the fraud, not directly, but the fraud had contributed. Ellen had discovered what was happening to her money 3 weeks before her death. She had discovered it not because anyone warned her, but because the person defrauding her had finally taken enough that she could no longer afford her medication. The stress had been significant. Her health had declined rapidly. The daughter wrote that she understood we had followed procedure. She wrote that she did not blame us. Not exactly, not legally. She wrote that she only wanted us to know what had happened. She wanted someone to know. She wanted to be certain that we understood. I read the letter 3 times. Then I placed it in a file and locked the file in my desk drawer and went home early, which I had never done before in 11 years. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in my bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about Ellen, whom I had never met and now would never meet. I thought about her account, her transactions, her life reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet. I thought about Thomas, who had asked if we could contact her, who had asked if there was something more we could do. I thought about the answer I had given him. The rules were clear. The procedures were explicit. I had followed them precisely. And in doing so, I had failed. This was the realization that broke something in me. Not that I had made the wrong choice, but that I had made the correct choice. And it had still been wrong. The system I had trusted, the rules I had followed, the procedures I had built my entire career upon, they had not protected Ellen. They had not even tried. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had documented. It had reported. It had moved the case through the appropriate channels at the appropriate pace. And Ellen had died. I returned to work the next morning. I sat at my desk and watched the sun rise over the same skyline, and I processed the same documentation I had always processed. The elevator still made the same sound on the 47th floor. The corner office still faced east. Everything was exactly as it had been, and nothing was the same. I began to notice things I had not noticed before. Cases that moved too slowly. Reports that sat in queues for weeks while people waited. Patterns that suggested harm. Real harm. Harm to real people whose lives had been reduced to numbers. I noticed that the system was not designed to protect them. The system was designed to protect the institution. The rules existed not to prevent harm, but to prevent liability. The procedures I had followed so faithfully had never been about helping Ellen or anyone like her. They had been about documentation, about defense, about building a record that would prove, if anyone ever asked, that we had done our job. And we had. We had done our job perfectly. I did not know what to do with this knowledge. I could not unlearn it. I could not return to the certainty I had felt before, the faith that systems would protect people if only we followed them correctly. I had followed them correctly. I had done everything right. And it had not been enough. The months that followed were difficult. I continued to do my work, but the work felt different. Every case I reviewed, every report I filed, every procedure I followed, I found myself asking questions I had never asked before. What if following the rules was not enough? What if the rules themselves were the problem? I did not share these thoughts with anyone. They would have been dangerous thoughts to share. And I was still, despite everything, a compliance officer. I understood the value of discretion, but the thoughts persisted. They grew. They became impossible to ignore. And then, 8 months after Ellen's daughter sent her letter, I found myself facing another case, another elderly customer, another pattern of suspicious withdrawals, another report that would move through the system at the pace the system required. I sat at my desk with the file in my hands, and I thought about Ellen. I thought about Thomas. I thought about the letter I had locked in my drawer and never shared with anyone. I thought about what it would mean to follow the rules, and I thought about what it would mean to break them. This is the moment I return to, again and again, in the years since. This is the moment when everything changed, though I did not understand it at the time. I sat at my desk with a file in my hands, and I made a choice. I chose to follow the rules. I documented the case. I filed the report. I moved it through the appropriate channels at the appropriate pace. I did exactly what procedure required, exactly what my training demanded, exactly what 11 years of experience had taught me was correct. And then I went home, and I did not sleep, and I spent the entire night wondering if I had made the same mistake twice. The customer's name was Margaret. I learned this later, the same way I learned Ellen's name, after it was already too late. The pattern was identical. The outcome was almost identical. The system did exactly what it was designed to do, and Margaret lost everything. She did not die. That is the only difference. She survived, diminished, living with family, who took her in after her savings were gone. I know this because I looked. I looked for her the way I had never looked for Ellen, because I needed to know. I needed to understand what my choice had meant. I resigned from the institution 3 weeks later. I gave 2 weeks' notice, which was standard. I worked diligently through my remaining days, which was also standard. I didn't explain my decision to anyone, though I suspect some of them understood. I had lost faith, not in systems exactly, but in my ability to serve them. I had discovered that there was a gap between following rules and doing good, and I could not bridge that gap while remaining in my position. The rules did not allow for bridging. I think about this often now. I think about Ellen and Margaret and all the others whose names I never learned. I think about Thomas, who saw what I could not see and left before the cost became clear. I think about the letter in my desk drawer, which I took with me when I left and which I still have, folded in a box in my closet. I think about what I believed and what I learned and the distance between them. I was certain that following the rules was the same as doing the right thing. I was certain that systems, properly designed and faithfully followed, would protect people. I was certain that my job was to document, to report, to move cases through the appropriate channels at the appropriate pace. I was wrong. Not about everything, not entirely. Systems do protect people sometimes. Rules do prevent harm sometimes. The work I did for 11 years was not without value. But I was wrong about the most important thing. I was wrong to believe that following procedure absolved me of responsibility. I was wrong to believe that the system would take care of the rest. The system does not take care of anything. The system is only rules, written by people, followed by people. And the outcomes it produces are the outcomes people allow it to produce. I allowed it to produce Ellen's outcome. I allowed it to produce Margaret's outcome. I followed the rules precisely. And in doing so, I made choices that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. This is not a confession. I am not seeking absolution. I do not believe absolution is possible for choices of this kind. And even if it were, I would not deserve it. This is simply an accounting, a record of what happened and what I learned and what it cost. I still believe in rules. I still believe that systems properly designed can protect people. But I no longer believe that following rules is always the right thing to do. I no longer believe that systems can substitute for judgment. Sometimes the rules are wrong. Sometimes the system fails. And when it does, the people who follow the rules are not innocent. They are complicit. I was complicit. I understand that now. I understood it the night I read Ellen's daughter's letter. I understood it the morning I filed Margaret's report. I understood it every time I chose to follow procedure instead of asking whether procedure was enough. The choice was always mine. The rules did not make me helpless. They only made it easier to feel helpless, to believe that my hands were tied, that there was nothing I could do. There was always something I could do. There was always a choice. I made the wrong one. Again and again. For 11 years, I made the wrong one. And I called it compliance. I called it procedure. I called it doing my job. I called it everything except what it was. The elevator still makes that sound, I imagine. The same soft chime. The same pause that lasts a fraction too long. Someone else sits in the corner office now, watching the sun rise over the same skyline, reviewing documentation that most people would find unbearable. I hope they find it comforting. I hope they believe, as I once believed, that numbers follow rules and procedures have outcomes, and that if you follow the correct steps in the correct order, you arrive at the correct result. I hope they never learn what I learned. But if they do, if they ever find themselves holding a file and asking whether following the rules is enough, I hope they remember that the choice is always theirs. The system will not decide for them. The procedures will not absolve them. The rules will not protect them from the weight of their own decisions. Nothing will. That is what I learned. That is what cost me my career and my certainty and my peace of mind. And that is what I carry with me now, every day, as I try to rebuild something meaningful from the wreckage of what I once believed.